The day Walter opened that metal case, three people he had never met started watching his house. He did not know that yet. He just knew that his hands were shaking as he cut through the tape on the lid, standing in a dusty storage unit that smelled like old motor oil and damp cardboard. The unit had belonged to Raymond Holt. Raymond had been a physicist, a quiet man who spent 40 years working on infrastructure restoration projects and who had died alone in a care facility a few months earlier, without any family to speak of. Walter had known him the way you know a colleague you respect but never fully understand. They had worked on the same municipal restoration contract years back. Raymond had always seemed like a man carrying something heavy that he never put down. When the facility called Walter and told him he was the only contact name Raymond had left, Walter assumed it would mean signing a few forms and maybe sorting through some old technical manuals. Instead, he drove 40 minutes to a self-storage place on the edge of an industrial district, collected the key from the facility administrator, and found a unit that was almost completely empty. No furniture. No boxes of personal items, no photographs. Just a metal shelf along one wall with 3 neatly labeled folders of old technical drawings, and on the floor in the center of the room, a single flat metal case about the size of a large book, locked with a combination padlock. The folders were standard professional material. Survey notes, material specifications, building reports. Walter flipped through them quickly and set them aside. The case was different. It had weight to it. A dense, deliberate kind of weight, like something that had been packed carefully by someone who had thought hard about what to include and what to leave out. There was no label, no note attached, just the padlock. Walter is not someone who breaks into things. He stood there for a solid minute wondering whether he should just hand the whole case over to whatever legal process handles the estates of people who die without a will. Then he noticed something. On the underside of the metal shelf, someone had written a 6-digit number in permanent marker. Small, neat, easy to miss if you were not looking at the underside of shelves, which most people never are. The combination worked on the first try. Inside the case, a reel-to-reel audio tape in a protective sleeve, a hand-drawn map of what appeared to be a city's underground utility grid, dense with annotations in Raymond's precise handwriting, and a single folded note. Walter unfolded it. 4 words and a period. They already knew. They've always known. Walter drove home with the case on the passenger seat. He told himself it was probably nothing. An old man's private research project, maybe some kind of personal obsession that had built up quietly over decades, the kind of thing that happens to solitary people with too much time and too sharp a mind. He almost convinced himself. Then, 2 nights later, he woke up at just past 2 in the morning to the sound of his back door being tried from the outside, a slow, careful, testing kind of sound. By the time he got downstairs, whoever it was had gone. The door had no visible damage, nothing in the house had been touched. But the case, which Walter had left on his kitchen table, had been moved 6 inches to the right, not taken, just moved. As if someone had picked it up, examined it, and set it back down. Someone had been inside his house and left without taking anything. That is not how a regular break-in works. That is how a message works. If you find this kind of investigation as unsettling as Walter did, stay with us, subscribe, and hit the like button. It helps more people find this story. Walter did not sleep again that night. He sat at the kitchen table with the case in front of him and the hand-drawn map spread out under the lamp. The city grid on the map was not labeled, but the street proportions looked familiar in a way he could not immediately place. He traced the main arterial lines with his finger. The annotations were in Raymond's handwriting, but used a shorthand Walter did not recognize. Numbers, compass notations, abbreviations that meant nothing to him yet. In the center of the map, several sites were circled in red ink, 6 of them. Each circle had a small symbol beside it that looked like a cross between an antenna schematic and an architectural floor plan. Walter looked at the tape. He did not own a reel-to-reel player. It took him 3 days to track down a working one through a second-hand audio equipment dealer who operated out of a warehouse and seemed mildly surprised that anyone still needed one. Walter paid cash, carried the player home, threaded the tape with hands that were steadier than he expected, and pressed play. The voice that came out of the speaker was Raymond's, calm, unhurried, precise. The same voice Walter remembered from years of project meetings, but the content was nothing like any project meeting Walter had ever sat through. Raymond did not introduce himself. He did not explain the context. He began mid-thought, as if he had already been talking for some time before he started the recording, as if he had rehearsed this so many times in his own head that the preamble no longer felt necessary. The first thing Raymond said was this. He said he was not the first person to find the pattern. He said there had been others before him, researchers, engineers, at least one architectural historian he had corresponded with for several years, and that every single one of them had reached the same point in their investigation and then gone quiet. Not retired quietly, not moved on to other work, gone quiet in ways that did not quite add up when you looked at the details. Positions eliminated. Research access revoked. One person whose published article had disappeared from 2 separate academic databases within 6 months of going live, with no correction notice, no retraction, just gone, as if it had never existed. Raymond said he had spent a long time deciding whether to keep going after he understood the pattern of what happened to the others. He said the thing that made him continue was not courage. It was something more uncomfortable than courage. It was the fact that once he had seen what he had seen, he could not find a way to unsee it, and he thought that if he was going to carry it anyway, he might as well put it somewhere it could outlast him. Walter sat in his kitchen with the tape turning slowly on the reel, and outside the window, the street was completely quiet, and the lamp made a small warm circle on the table, and everything beyond that circle felt very dark and very large. Raymond had found something inside a wall that should have been solid brick for over 150 years, and his supervisor told him to forget he ever saw it. That is where the tape went next. Raymond's voice stayed calm the whole time, which made it harder to listen to, not easier. He described a restoration job he had taken early in his career, a municipal building scheduled for partial demolition to make way for a utilities upgrade. Standard work, the kind of job where you spend your days in dust and plaster smell and the particular cold that old public buildings hold in their walls, even in summer. Raymond was part of the survey team, responsible for documenting structural features before demolition began. On the 3rd day, a section of interior wall came down, and behind it, instead of the rubble fill everyone expected, the crew found something else entirely. Copper, not pipes. Not wiring, flat copper strips running vertically inside the wall cavity, connected at intervals by horizontal crosspieces, forming a grid that covered the entire interior face of the outer wall from floor to ceiling. The strips were not corroded the way copper corrodes when it sits damp for a century. They had darkened evenly, a deep reddish brown, the way copper looks when it has been used, when current has moved through it regularly over a long period of time. The configuration matched no electrical standard Raymond had ever seen. The building had no electrical system when it was originally constructed. The copper had been there from day one, built into the original structure, enclosed in the wall deliberately, as if whoever put it there did not want it visible, but absolutely needed it in place. Raymond photographed everything before anyone told him not to. He counted the strips, measured the intervals, noted the precise gauge of the material. Then his supervisor appeared at his shoulder, looked at the wall for about 10 seconds, and told him in a flat voice to close the survey report without including the copper installation. Raymond asked why. The supervisor said the copper was probably a later addition, a private modification by some tenant decades ago, and that documenting undocumented modifications created liability complications the project did not need. Raymond looked at the patina on the copper. He looked at the mortar around the edges of the cavity, which was original, unbroken, which meant nothing had been opened and resealed. He said nothing and nodded and filed the report the way he was told, but he kept his own photographs. And that night in his rented room 2 blocks from the site, he sat under a bare bulb and looked at them for a long time. The proportions nagged at him. The spacing between the copper strips followed a ratio he recognized from engineering school, a ratio that appears in certain resonance calculations, the kind you use when you are designing a system to receive and hold an oscillating frequency. Not transmit, receive, and hold, like an antenna built not to broadcast but to collect. Walter stopped the tape at that point and sat very still, because he had walked past a building exactly like the one Raymond was describing. He passed it twice a week on his way to the hardware supplier he used for his own contracting work. A heavy stone civic building with a copper-trimmed roof and a dome that always caught the morning light in a way that made it look slightly too bright for the street around it. He had never thought about it as anything other than old and solid and slightly too grand for its surroundings. He let the tape keep running. Raymond went on to describe what happened over the following years, how he quietly sought out similar restoration projects, how he found the same copper configurations in 3 more buildings across 2 different regions, how each time the feature was either absent from the official survey documentation or recorded as a later modification of unknown origin. And then Raymond said something that made Walter set down the mug he had been holding. Raymond said that when he began to map the locations of every building where he had personally confirmed the copper installation or where other documentation strongly suggested it, the sites did not scatter randomly. They clustered. They grouped in ways that suggested they had been positioned in relation to each other, not independently designed and independently placed, but coordinated, as if they were components in something larger that had been installed across an entire region at once. Raymond paused on the tape. Walter could hear him breathing. Then Raymond said that a network needs a source, and that finding the buildings was only the first part of the question. The second part was understanding what they had all been connected to. And that second part was what had led him to the old maps. The maps were the key to everything, and what Raymond found in them was something that should not have been possible to hide. Walter turned the tape over to side 2 and pressed play. Raymond's voice came back immediately, no gap, no hesitation, as if he had recorded both sides in a single sitting without stopping. He said he wanted to talk about the maps first, because without them, the rest of what he had to say would sound like the kind of thing a person invents to explain something they cannot otherwise understand. He was careful about that. He did not want Walter, or whoever ended up listening, to think he had started with a conclusion and worked backwards. He had started with copper strips in a wall and worked forwards, step by step, and the maps were simply where the steps had led. Raymond had spent several evenings in a regional archive that held old cartographic collections, the kind of archive that exists in most mid-sized cities, underfunded, understaffed, with a single part-time librarian who was always slightly apologetic about the state of the catalog. The maps he was looking for were from a period of 2 or 3 centuries back, trade and diplomatic documents produced by European cartographers who were mapping the known world as thoroughly as their methods allowed. What struck Raymond immediately was not what the maps showed. It was how confident they were. These were not exploratory sketches or rough approximations. They were detailed, cross-referenced, produced with the kind of precision that comes from reliable sources on the ground. And across a huge portion of the northern landmass, the maps named and described a civilization that today almost nobody talks about. Cities, trade routes, administrative regions, a flag, diplomatic notes in the margins referencing formal correspondence with rulers whose titles were recorded carefully, respectfully, the way you record the titles of powers you take seriously. And then Raymond pulled a map from roughly a century and a half later, from the same cartographic tradition, produced by institutions with even better tools and even more information. And that civilization was simply gone. Not absorbed, not renamed, gone. The land was still there. The rivers and mountain ranges were still there, but the name, the cities, the political structure, all of it had been replaced by a vague administrative designation that told you nothing about what had been there before. Raymond said he had cross-referenced this disappearance with every major historical record he could access. There was no war that explained it, no documented collapse, no famine, no series of conquests that would account for the complete erasure of something that size in that time frame. Civilizations leave traces of their endings. They leave ruins and records and accounts from the people who watched them fall. This one left almost nothing. What it left instead were buildings, hundreds of buildings across dozens of regions, all built or significantly rebuilt during the same narrow window of time that followed the disappearance, all sharing the same engineering signatures Raymond had been finding in walls for 30 years. He stopped the tape again briefly and then said something Walter found himself replaying 3 times. Raymond said that the most effective way to erase a civilization is not to destroy its buildings. It is to let the buildings stand and simply stop teaching people what the buildings mean. And that is exactly what had happened. The evidence was not buried or locked away. It was displayed publicly in every major city that had inherited the infrastructure. It was just displayed without its context, without its explanation, the way you might exhibit a complex piece of machinery in a museum without the label that tells you what it actually does. Walter looked at the hand-drawn map on the table in front of him. He looked at the 6 circled sites in red ink. He picked up his phone and opened a satellite map of his own city. He found the first circled location, then the second, then the third. All 3 were buildings he recognized. All 3 were within a mile of where he was sitting right now, and on the satellite image, when he drew a line connecting them, the line did not curve or wander. It was perfectly straight, and it kept going. Every major city on Earth is sitting on top of a power grid that nobody built in the 19th century, and Raymond had the measurements to prove it. That is what the second side of the tape was about. Raymond did not say it dramatically. He said it the way an engineer states a finding after years of careful measurement, flatly, with the quiet confidence of someone who has checked and rechecked the numbers enough times that drama would feel redundant. Walter sat at his kitchen table with the satellite map still open on his phone and the hand-drawn grid still spread under the lamp and listened to Raymond explain what he had spent 30 years putting together. The buildings Raymond had tracked across his career were not isolated anomalies. They were consistent. Across dozens of sites in multiple regions, the same features appeared with a regularity that ruled out coincidence. The copper installations always followed the same internal geometry. The ratio between the height of the structure and the diameter of any dome or curved roof element was always the same fraction. A fraction Raymond had calculated corresponded to a specific atmospheric frequency range. The entrance orientation deviated from true magnetic north by the same small angle at every site, not approximately the same, exactly the same, down to a fraction of a degree. And the spacing between the buildings, when Raymond mapped their positions relative to each other, followed intervals that repeated consistently across different cities in different regions. Raymond said he had shown these measurements to a colleague once, a man who had spent his career working on signal propagation in large-scale electrical systems. He had not told the colleague where the measurements came from. He had just presented the numbers. The colleague had looked at them for a few minutes and then said, without hesitation, that the configuration described a receiving array, a system designed to pull ambient electrical energy from a large atmospheric area and concentrate it at specific collection points. The colleague had assumed Raymond was describing a theoretical design for a modern energy project. When Raymond told him the measurements came from buildings constructed over a century ago, the colleague had gone very quiet and then changed the subject and never brought it up again. Walter extended the line on his phone map further in both directions. To the east, it passed through an old train station he had driven past 100 times, a heavy stone building with a copper-trimmed roof and a central dome that had always seemed slightly oversized for a regional transit hub. To the west, the line ran directly to a large civic hall near the river, the kind of building that appears in every tourist photograph of the area without anyone ever thinking hard about why it looks the way it looks. Walter counted 6 buildings total on the line within the city limits. 6 buildings, all old, all public, all with the architectural features Raymond had described, all sitting on a perfectly straight axis. Raymond on the tape said the 19th century had not invented this system. It had inherited it, and what it inherited, it did not fully understand. The engineers and architects of that period had copied the forms of older structures with great care and considerable skill. But the knowledge of why those forms mattered, the specific understanding of what the geometry and the materials actually did, had already been lost by the time the copying began. They were reproducing a technology they could no longer read, the way someone might carefully reconstruct an ancient instrument without knowing what music it was built to play. And because they did not understand what they were building, they did not notice when the pieces that made it functional were quietly removed and replaced with something that looked similar but did not work the same way. Raymond paused on the tape for a long moment. Then he said that the replacement had not been accidental. And that was the part, he said, that had taken him the longest to accept. Walter put down his phone and looked out the window at the dark street. Somewhere 3 blocks away, on the axis of that perfectly straight line, the dome of the old civic building caught the orange glow of the streetlights and held it in a way that made the stone look almost warm. The tape kept turning. Claire had been the one who found the institution. That was the first thing Walter discovered when he started pulling the thread that Raymond had left for him, and it hit him harder than anything on the tape had. He had not planned to research Raymond's past. He had planned to sit with the tape for a few days, think carefully, and decide what to do. But the line on the satellite map would not leave him alone. 6 buildings in a straight axis through his own city, and Raymond's measurements sitting in a locked case on his kitchen table. And someone had already been inside his house once without breaking anything. Walter was not a person who frightens easily, but he was also not a person who ignores patterns. And the pattern here was too clear to ignore. He started with what he knew. Raymond had worked in infrastructure restoration for most of his career. Walter searched his name in a professional database and found the expected list of project credits. Municipal buildings, civic halls, a regional archive facility, a transit depot. All old structures. All the kind of work that pays steadily without ever making anyone famous. But on the 3rd page of results, alongside a restoration project from roughly 15 years back, Raymond's name appeared in a co-credit with someone else. A woman named Claire Ashford, listed as structural historian and research consultant. Walter searched Claire's name. She had a modest professional profile, a university affiliation, a short list of published articles in architectural history journals. He clicked through to her most recent article. The title was dry and technical, the kind of title designed to be read only by specialists, but the abstract underneath it described something that made Walter read it twice. Claire had written about anomalous material configurations in civic buildings of the 19th century. Specifically about copper elements whose placement and gauge did not correspond to any documented construction practice of the period. The article had been published in a peer-reviewed journal. It was thorough and carefully sourced and written in the measured language of academic research. Walter checked the publication date, then he searched the journal's current online archive. The article was not there. He searched 2 academic databases. Not there either. He found a cached reference to it in an old university newsletter that had been archived before the article disappeared. Just a 1-line mention of Claire's recent publication, enough to confirm it had existed. The article itself was gone from every accessible source. Walter found Claire's university profile next. The page loaded, but the content was stripped back. No current position listed. No contact information. The last activity timestamp on her faculty page was from over a year ago. He found an older version of the page through a web archive service, a version from 2 years back, that showed her listed as a senior research fellow with an office address and a university email. All of that was gone now. The university website simply showed her name in a list of former affiliated researchers with no further information. Walter sat back in his chair. Claire had published research that touched directly on what Raymond had spent his career documenting. Her article had disappeared from the record. Her university position had quietly dissolved. And Raymond, who had worked alongside her, had spent the last years of his life recording everything he knew onto a tape and sealing it in a locked metal case in a storage unit he had left to the one colleague he still trusted. Walter found an address for Claire through an old conference listing that had not been scrubbed from the web yet, a residential address in a town about 2 hours' drive away. He wrote it down on the back of one of Raymond's technical folders and looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at the case. Then he looked at the address again. He drove there on a Tuesday morning when the sky was low and gray and the roads were almost empty. He found the street. He found the house number. The house was a small place set back from the road behind an overgrown front hedge, the kind of overgrowth that happens when no one has been tending to things for several months. The curtains were closed. The mailbox at the end of the path was stuffed full, envelopes and flyers compressed into a thick block that had not been cleared in a long time. Walter knocked. No answer. He knocked again and stood listening to the silence inside. A neighbor from the house next door came out to check her bins and looked at Walter with the careful expression of someone deciding whether to say anything. Walter asked, as casually as he could manage, whether she knew if the resident was away. The neighbor said she did not know. She said the woman who lived there had left suddenly one morning a few months back. A car had come very early, and she had come out with one bag and gotten in, and that was the last anyone on the street had seen of her. The neighbor said she had seemed in a hurry. Not frightened, just focused, the way someone looks when they have made a decision and are moving before they can second-guess it. Walter thanked her and turned back toward his car. Then he stopped. On the front step of Claire's house, half hidden under the overgrown hedge, was a small package wrapped in brown paper. It was addressed to Raymond Holt. Walter stood very still for a moment. Raymond had been dead for months. This package had been sent after his death to an address that was not his by someone who apparently knew Claire and had not heard that Raymond was gone. Or by someone who had sent it, knowing full well that Raymond would never receive it, and that whoever came looking for Claire would find it instead. Walter picked it up. It was light, something flat inside, rigid, about the size of a photograph. He looked at the return address. There was none. He looked at the postmark. Recent, within the last few weeks. Then he looked up at the street sign on the corner of Claire's block. He pulled out his phone and checked the satellite map. He checked the line. The perfectly straight line running through 6 buildings in his city extended outward, and when he traced it far enough, it passed through this town, 2 blocks from where he was standing, running directly under the street he had just driven down. Whatever Claire had sent, she had sent it from directly on the line. Nobody suppresses a conspiracy with dramatic raids and black cars. They do it with paperwork, with budget cycles, with the quiet withdrawal of things that people need to keep going. That was the part of Raymond's tape that Walter kept coming back to on the drive home from Claire's street. He had the brown paper package on the passenger seat next to him, still unopened, and the gray sky outside had started to spit rain against the windshield, and Raymond's voice was running through his head in that flat, careful tone that somehow made everything worse than shouting would have. Walter had listened to the full tape twice by this point. He knew what Raymond said about suppression, almost word for word. But sitting in the car with Claire's empty house behind him and a package addressed to a dead man in his lap, the words landed differently than they had in his kitchen. Raymond had spent a section of the tape describing the mechanism of it, not as a theory, as an observed pattern with specific examples, the way an engineer documents a recurring fault in a system. He had watched it happen to Claire directly. After her article published, nothing dramatic occurred. No one contacted her with threats. No one showed up at her door. What happened instead was quieter and more effective than any of that. Her research funding application for the following year was declined without detailed explanation. The peer review process for her next submission stretched to 14 months and ended in rejection on grounds she described to Raymond as technically worded but essentially meaningless. A collaboration she had been building with a colleague at another institution fell apart when that colleague abruptly withdrew without giving a reason. Each of these things, taken alone, looked like ordinary professional bad luck. Funding gets declined, papers get rejected, collaborations fall through. It happens to everyone in academic research at some point. The difference was the timing. Every single setback arrived within an 18-month window after the article that had disappeared from the databases, and the cumulative effect was total. Within 2 years, Claire had no funding, no active publication pipeline, and no institutional position. She had not been fired. She had simply been made unfeasible. Raymond said on the tape that this was the method because it was deniable at every individual step. No single actor had to do anything obviously wrong. The system just had to make continued research more costly than stopping at every level simultaneously until stopping became the rational choice. Raymond called it a friction strategy. You do not block a door. You just make the corridor leading to it long enough and difficult enough that most people turn around before they reach it. And the people who designed the corridor can always point to the corridor and say, "Look, the door is right there. Nobody is stopping anyone," and they would be technically correct. Walter pulled into his driveway and sat in the car for a moment with the engine off. The rain was heavier now, drumming on the roof in an uneven rhythm. He thought about his own email to the urban planning contact, the casual question about architectural features, the 2 visitors at his workplace 48 hours later. He had told himself that was a coincidence, or at least he had tried to. He was done trying. He picked up the package from the passenger seat and went inside. Walter opened Claire's package at the kitchen table under the same lamp where he had first read Raymond's note, and what was inside stopped him completely. It was a photograph, printed on standard photo paper, the kind you get from a home printer, slightly warm to the touch from being enclosed in the brown paper. The image showed the interior of a building Walter did not immediately recognize. A large vaulted space, stone walls, high narrow windows letting in a pale flat light. In the center of the frame, exposed where a section of wall plaster had been removed, was a copper installation. The same flat strips, the same vertical and horizontal grid pattern, the same even dark patina that Raymond had described finding in the wall of that first demolition site decades ago. But this one was larger, much larger. The strips ran from floor to ceiling across a section of wall at least 6 meters wide, and the cross-piece intervals were more complex than anything Raymond had described, layered in a secondary pattern within the primary grid, like a circuit built inside a circuit. Walter turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting he did not recognize, were 2 things: a set of coordinates and a single word, open. He typed the coordinates into his phone. The map loaded and dropped a pin. Walter looked at the location. He looked at it for a long time. Then he pulled up his satellite map with the axis line still drawn across his city. He extended the line the way he had extended it before, the way it had led him to Claire's street. He kept going. He pushed the line further out along the same bearing. The pin sat directly on it. The coordinates pointed to a location roughly 40 minutes outside the city, in an area Walter knew only as mixed industrial and older residential. He switched to Street View. The image showed a wide stone building set back from the road behind a chain-link fence, large and heavy-shouldered, with a copper-trimmed facade and a low dome at its center that had gone green with age. The building looked like a civic hall that had been transplanted somewhere it did not belong. There was a sign on the fence, but the street view image was old enough that the sign was too blurred to read clearly. Walter looked at the coordinates again. He looked at the word on the back of the photograph. Open. It was not an instruction. It was a label. Something in that building had been opened, recently enough that someone had photographed it and sent the image to Raymond, not knowing Raymond was already gone. Claire had found something inside that building, something she wanted Raymond to see, and then Claire had left her house with one bag and not come back. Walter sat with the photograph in his hands and thought about the friction strategy Raymond had described, the long corridor designed to make people turn around. He thought about the two visitors at his workplace. He thought about the combination written on the underside of a shelf in a storage unit that almost no one would ever have reason to check. Raymond had left him a path that was only visible if you were already looking. Claire had sent a photograph to a dead man on the assumption that the right person would eventually find it. Both of them had understood something that Walter was only now fully absorbing. The people running the friction strategy were patient. They did not need to stop everyone. They only needed to stop most people. The ones who kept going anyway were expected to feel alone and unsupported and increasingly uncertain about whether what they were seeing was real. Walter stood up, folded the photograph carefully, and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, close enough to feel the slight pressure of it against his ribs. Then he got his car keys. The building in the coordinates was 40 minutes away, and it was still light outside, and whatever Claire had found in that wall was either still there or it was not, and the only way to find out was to go and look. The building in the photograph was not abandoned. Someone was maintaining it, and they did not want anyone to know. Walter figured that out before he even got out of the car. He had pulled up on the road opposite the site, engine off, and sat looking at it through the windshield for a few minutes the way Raymond had probably looked at those copper installations before deciding whether to photograph them. The building matched the street view image on his phone, but the street view was years old and things had changed. The chain link fence had been replaced with a newer solid panel fence, the kind that gives nothing away about what is behind it. The dome was still visible above the fence line, and the copper cladding on it was still green with age, but the gutters along the roof line were clean and unblocked, and the stonework around the upper windows had been recently repointed, the new mortar a slightly lighter gray than the original. Someone was spending money on this building. Quietly, without any visible signage or public record, they were keeping it in good condition. Walter got out and walked the perimeter of the fence slowly, like someone who had taken a wrong turn and was looking for a street number. At the rear of the building there was a vehicle access gate padlocked, and beside it a smaller pedestrian door set into the fence panel. Walter tried the handle. It opened. Not broken, not forced, simply unlocked. He stood in the gateway for a moment with the late afternoon light behind him throwing his shadow forward across a gravel yard. Then he went in. The main entrance of the building was a pair of heavy wooden doors with iron fittings, the kind of doors that had been built to last several centuries and had. The right-hand door was not fully closed. A thin, vertical line of darkness showed at the edge where it had been pulled to but not latched. Walter put his hand flat against the wood and pushed, and the door swung inward on hinges that made no sound at all, which meant someone had oiled them recently, and that detail made the back of his neck prickle in a way that walking through an obviously abandoned building never would have. Inside, the air was cold and still and carried the smell of old stone and something else underneath it, a faint metallic scent, thin and sharp, like the air near high-voltage equipment. The entrance hall was large, with a vaulted ceiling and narrow windows set high in the walls, exactly as in Claire's photograph. The floor was stone flags, swept clean. No debris, no pigeon droppings, no signs of the slow interior decay that empty old buildings always show. Walter took out his phone and turned on the torch and swept it across the walls. On the far wall, exactly where Claire's photograph had shown it, a large section of plaster had been removed. The copper installation was exposed from floor to ceiling across a section of wall that Walter paced at roughly 7 meters wide. He stood in front of it and held the torch steady and looked at it for a long time. The patina was the same deep reddish-brown Raymond had described. The geometry was precise and complex, the secondary pattern layered within the primary grid exactly as the photograph had shown. Walter reached out and touched one of the vertical strips. The metal was cold and very slightly rough under his fingertips, the texture of something old and completely unhurried by time. He took out his phone and started photographing everything. He worked methodically, the way Raymond had worked, moving along the wall section by section, capturing the details of the cross-piece intervals and the junction points. He was on his 4th photograph when he heard the sound. Footsteps on stone from somewhere deeper in the building, steady and unhurried, moving toward him. Walter did not run. There was something in the pace of the footsteps that was not aggressive. They were measured, deliberate, the footsteps of someone who already knew he was there and had decided to come and speak to him rather than call anyone. He lowered his phone and turned to face the interior corridor that opened off the entrance hall and waited. The woman who came through the corridor doorway was somewhere in her mid-50s, wearing a heavy canvas jacket and work boots, with short, gray-streaked hair and the kind of unhurried expression that comes from having made peace with a difficult situation a long time ago. She looked at Walter, and then at the copper wall, and then back at Walter. She said his name, not as a question, as a confirmation, the way you say a name when you have been expecting someone and they have finally arrived. Her name was Claire. Walter had prepared himself for several possible versions of this moment on the drive over, but not for this one. He had imagined finding an empty building with a broken wall and some old copper, and the specific quiet disappointment of a trail that had gone cold. He had not imagined Claire herself standing in the corridor looking at him with the calm expression of someone who had left a package on a doorstep and then simply waited to see who would pick it up. She had not disappeared because she was frightened. She had disappeared because she needed to work without being watched, and the only way to do that was to make herself unfindable. She had known about the friction strategy because Raymond had explained it to her years before it was applied to her. She had watched it happen to herself with a kind of detached clarity that she said felt strange at the time, but had turned out to be useful. When the last of her institutional footing dissolved, she had not waited for the next move. She had simply stepped off the board entirely. New address, no public profile, no digital footprint worth following. She had kept working on her own time with her own resources, and the building in the coordinates was where that work had led. She walked Walter through the interior of the building over the next 2 hours, and he listened and looked and understood for the first time what Raymond had spent 40 years assembling toward. The copper installation in the entrance hall was one of 4 in the building, each in a different wall, each oriented to a different compass bearing, the 4 of them together forming a collection array that Raymond's measurements predicted would function across a very large atmospheric area. Claire had found the maintenance records for the building in a local authority archive, records that went back over 150 years, and that showed the structure had been in continuous use for almost its entire existence, passing between institutional owners in transfers that were legally routine and historically invisible. It had never been truly empty. It had never been decommissioned. It had just been made unremarkable, which was a different thing entirely. What Claire had discovered in the previous months was the part that Walter had not been prepared for. She had traced the ownership chain back through every transfer, through every administrative reassignment, through the various bodies and holding structures that had managed the building across a century and a half. At every step, buried in the language of routine bureaucratic transfer, the same operational instruction appeared, not to restore the building, not to develop it, simply to maintain it, to keep it in good structural condition, to ensure the copper elements remained intact and undisturbed. The instruction had been passed from one institution to the next, like a relay baton, The reasoning behind it long since separated from the action itself, so that the people currently paying for the maintenance almost certainly did not know what they were maintaining or why. They were just following the last instruction in a chain that went back further than any of them had thought to look. Claire showed Walter the document. A single page from the original transfer record, handwritten, dated from the mid-1800s. The instruction was there in plain legal language, 8 words that had survived 150 years of institutional shuffling without anyone thinking to question them. Preserve the interior copper elements without alteration or removal. That was all. No explanation, no technical specification, just the instruction, written by someone who knew exactly what the copper was for and was determined that it would outlast the knowledge of why it mattered. Walter stood in the cold interior with Claire's torch and Raymond's tape in his memory, and 6 buildings on a straight line through his city, and a single-page document in his hands, and understood that the suppression of this knowledge was never the whole story. Alongside the suppression, running parallel to it for 150 years, someone had also been quietly, patiently preserving the evidence, not in an archive, not in a vault, in the buildings themselves, maintained in plain sight, waiting for the moment when someone would look at them correctly. The cover-up and the preservation had been running side by side the whole time. The question was, which one would reach the right person first? It had reached Walter. And Walter understood now what Raymond had understood when he recorded the tape, and what Claire had understood when she sent the photograph to a dead man's address on the assumption that the right living person would eventually collect it. The only response to a friction strategy is patience and distribution. You do not fight a system that erases things by making one loud accusation that can be dismissed. You fight it the way the original builders had fought it, by putting the evidence somewhere durable and trusting that enough people, over enough time, would find it and understand it and pass it on. That is what Walter did. Not dramatically, not publicly, not in a way that attracted the kind of attention that brings 2 polite visitors to your workplace. He documented everything Claire had found, the 4 copper arrays, the ownership chain, the single-page instruction, the relationship between this building and the 6 on the axis through his city. He made copies, careful, thorough copies, and he distributed them through people he trusted, people who did not know about each other, people in different places with different connections, so that no single point of pressure could collapse the whole thing at once. The buildings are still standing. The copper is still in the walls. The axis line still runs through 6 structures in a city that passes them every day without reading them. The original instruction is still being followed by institutions that have long since forgotten why they are following it. None of that is hidden. All of it is simply waiting for the people who know what they are looking at. Here is the thing that this whole story kept pushing Walter toward, and that Raymond had known for 30 years, and that Claire had built her disappearance around. The most resilient kind of knowledge is not the kind that gets locked away. It is the kind that gets built into something large enough that you cannot move it, and left in a place where anyone can see it, and simply never explained. The cover-up is real, but so is the inheritance. And the inheritance has been sitting there in stone and copper and plain sight longer than anyone doing the covering has been alive. So here is the question that I want to leave with you. If the buildings in your city have been standing for 150 years with their copper intact and their geometry preserved, and no one in any official institution can give you a satisfying explanation for why they were built, the way they were built, what does that tell you about what we have actually been taught about where our world came from? Think about that and write your answer below, because I genuinely want to know what you think, and so does everyone else who just heard this. If this investigation hit you the way it hit Walter the first time he heard Raymond's voice on that tape, share it with someone who is ready to hear it. And if you want to follow where this thread goes next, subscribe and leave a like. It costs you nothing, and it means this kind of work keeps reaching the people it needs to reach.